as of now. I mean, whenever it turns up, we'll probably try and accommodate. But since we have only 3 speakers and there is time overrun that we had, the time will be compressed. So the time allotted to each of the speakers is not going to increase. So we'll still have each speaker will have 30 minutes, 15 minutes for presentation and 15 minutes for question answer. If Arup comes, then we'll have, they'll just invite the little bit of time overrun. We can manage, we have enough time to do that. May I invite the speakers now here. We have 3 speakers here. Kaivan Munshi, who is here, who will be presenting a paper on networks on caste and blacks. So that's, yeah, join us. Kaivan Munshi is a professor of economics at Brown University. His research interests include economic development, population and demography, economic analysis of institutions with particular emphasis on community-based institutions in developing countries. So we'll start with Kaivan first. Kaivan, you
can. Economy are typically tied to the land that they are born on. Typically, you will often find groups get locked into traditional occupations. And when you do observe mobility, it is often characterized by the movement of entire groups. This is certainly the story of mobility in India, starting in the 19th century with urbanization and industrialization. You had particular jatis which moved from the village to the city, finding niches in the labor market in different cities. It's a story of the US in the 19th century as well. You have European immigrants coming into particular niches in the US economy at that time. And you know, one of the things that you would really want to understand is the condition under which this kind of group mobilization, of collective mobilization, takes place. This is, I think, a very central question for development. This is something that Mark was alluding to in his talk as well, that we want to talk about development, we want to talk about growth, but we need to understand how these things actually happen. And the reality is we know very little about this. There's much to be learned about this, and I think it has implications not just for science, but also for policy. What I want to do today is to sort of try to tell you a little bit about what I have learned over the past 10 years or so, studying this particular question in different contexts. And the first thing I want to say is that based on this past research, I think there's basically 2 conditions that are necessary for this sort of collective mobilization. I think they're quite obvious. There's nothing earth-shattering about this. Basically, you need new opportunities. You need to have some kind of shock that is large enough to move this group from one place to the other, from one occupation to the other, from one location to the other. And then what you need is some kind of appropriate precondition, something which allows a particular group to take advantage of these new opportunities. And the way that I want to sort of convey this idea to you is through 2 examples based on my own research. The first example is a story about the movement of a particular low-caste community from agricultural labor into international business. This is based on a paper that just came out in the Review of Economic Studies. And the second example is based on black mobilization in the post-bellum South. So when I say post-bellum, bellum is a word for war. So this is after the American Civil War, which ran from 1861 to 1865. And this is new work with my colleague Ken Chin, who some of you know. Okay, so let me just jump straight into the first example. As I said, this is a story about a historically disadvantaged subcaste that took advantage of new opportunities that became available in the Indian diamond industry starting from the late 1960s over the next 40 or 50 years. This is a story about a transition from agriculture to international business. And what I'm going to try to convey to you is the role that was played by a community network in supporting this particular transition. Okay, so before I get to the details of that, let me just give you some background. This is an Indian audience, so I don't really need to tell you how important this industry is. 85% of the world's supply of rough diamonds are cut and polished in India. This is an industry with about 1 million workers and about 1,000 firms. So it's a very large industry. India doesn't produce rough diamonds, so there's basically 2 ways in which these diamond export firms access their rough stones. Most of these firms will actually go to Antwerp every month or every couple of months for a few days to source the rough stones. They get these rough stones on supplier credit. Nothing is in writing. And these are very valuable. I mean, this hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so the way that you actually get around the obvious commitment problem here is through the support of the community network. So each exporter will have maybe a couple of close connections, but if I want to get rough stone from someone that I don't know very well, then a person from my community who has close connections with that particular supplier will stand as guarantor. And what the community ties do is to basically prevent me from reneging on my obligation. There are, of course, other firms which are much more established, typically second or third generation businessmen who will have set up their own branches in Antwerp. There, of course, they don't need the network at all, they're just essentially vertically integrated. Once the stones are brought back to India, then they're cut and polished in workshops and factories, most of which are in cities like Surat and Navsari and places like that. And then the polished stones are sold on the Bombay market. And so my sense of this industry is that where the network really matters is at the rough stone stage. Okay, that's where things really matter a lot. Now, what's the social composition of this industry? Well, traditionally, starting from the mid-1960s, the trade in this industry was dominated by two traditional business communities, the Marwadis and the Palampuris. The cutting and the polishing of the stones was done by a lower caste of agricultural laborers known as the Kathiawardis. The opportunity here, as I remember what I said, is you need opportunities and you need preconditions. So here the opportunity was a massive supply shock in the late 1970s. You had the discovery of diamond deposits in Australia, the Argyle mines, and these mines actually supply 1/3 of the world's rough diamond supply today. So there was a massive supply shock at the time, and just around then, some of the Palampuri businessmen who had by that point in time established long-term relations with their Kathiawadi contractors had also established branches in Antwerp. So they basically apparently encouraged some of these people to move into the business end. And once the first Kathiawadis moved in, then slowly over time, their network grew stronger and stronger, allowing more and more people from that community to move into business. Now, the way that I think about the role of the network is essentially is a substitute for parental human capital. So if you're the son of a businessman, then you're going to inherit wealth, you're going to have connections, you're going to have all this support from your father. If you don't have that background, then what your community network does effectively is just substitute for that. And so the model that I write down in the paper actually tells us that in fact what's interesting is that if there's a community with relatively weak outside options, then the new network that forms will actually form relatively fast over time. And so what you're going to see here is that you're going to see, in fact, greater intergenerational mobility in the historically disadvantaged subcaste once this new opportunity kicks in. If there is an opportunity, then in fact it might in fact take advantage of it more readily than a caste which is more historically advantaged. Now to look at that with the data, what I did was to conduct a survey of close to 800 diamond firms in the Bombay market. What I want to show you is in fact the most interesting part of the paper is the background of these firms and how this changed over time. So what you have here on the x-axis is the establishment year of the firm. What you have on the y-axis is the probability that the entrepreneur is the son of a businessman. Now for the Palampuris and the Marwaris, of course, these are business communities, and so not surprisingly, most of them are the sons of businessmen. Now what the model says, of course, is over time, as the network gets stronger, there should be a decline. It should support people without a business background, and we see a mild decline, but it turns out this is actually not statistically significant. What's interesting for us is the Kathiawardis. Look at them. They start off with about 70% of them saying that they're the sons of businessmen, but from the late 1970s onwards, you start to see this very steep decline. And by 1995, basically 20% of them are the sons of businessmen. So there's this massive shift over time in the background of these people, and there is this intergenerational mobility. And our story, of course, there's this underlying network which is supporting this mobility. Where are they moving from? Well, now what you have here on the y-axis is whether the father was not a farmer. Okay, it's a bit confusing, but it's non-agriculturalist. Again, what you expect is these guys they're business communities, so basically all of them say that their father was not a farmer. But the Kathiawardis to begin with, 80 to 90% say that their father was not a farmer. But then you watch this thing declining, and by 2000, 70% of the people coming in say that their father was a farmer. So what you're seeing here is this transition over a 40-year period from agriculture into business. We're talking about hundreds of firms from this community coming into this new industry. So here is, I think, a very wonderful example along the lines of what Mark was saying today, of some kind of transition, something that matters. This is a success story. I'm not going to claim that we see this all the time. But what we're seeing here is one example of a successful transition. And what I want to do now is to very quickly switch over, before I do that, let me do one more thing, is to give you some additional evidence that there was this underlying network which is actually supporting it. You might go back here and say, well, maybe what's happening here is that the outside options for these guys are just getting worse and worse over time. As you have a bunch of losers coming in, they're doing really badly, but they don't care because the outside options are so weak as well. So what I managed to do after the survey was complete was to get data from the Gem and Jewelry Export Promotion Council for 95% of the firms in my sample over a 10-year period. So this is panel data on their exports. And what I'm doing here is to look at the export trajectory for these three different communities. Okay, the Palanpuris is the reference category, and this is telling us how the trajectory slope is different for the Kathiawardis relative to the Palanpuris. Now there's two effects over here. On one hand, you expect the trajectory to be steeper for the Kathiawardis because their network is getting stronger. But at the same time, we have this selection in of people who are weaker and weaker over time. And so the theory is sort of ambiguous about what the net effect is going to be. When you look at the unconditional regression, there's no they basically keep track with the Palanpuris and grow significantly faster than the Marwadis. But once you put in the firm fixed effects to control for that compositional change, what you find is, if anything, they're growing much faster than the other communities. So this is telling that there's some force that is actually driving the export trajectory for the Kathiawardis. And what I would argue that this is the underlying network which is strengthening relatively rapidly over time. So here's one example, as I said, of a story of a historically disadvantaged community that was able to take advantage of these opportunities when they became available. Now let's go back 150 years to the postbellum South. Okay, this is now a group of people who are extremely disadvantaged. They had very little opportunity to create social capital, to develop viable communities under slavery, and then all of a sudden, with emancipation in 1865, they're able to organize themselves and take advantage of whatever opportunities became available. And once again, what I'm going to argue is that they did take advantage of these opportunities, but only in those places where the conditions were appropriate for this kind of collective response. Okay, so let me give you some background on this. What we're going to take advantage of here is the fact that you have a lot of variation in cropping patterns across the American South. In those counties where labor-intensive plantation crops like sugar, or sugarcane, or rice, or cotton, or tobacco were grown, you would have had larger plantations under slavery. This could have supported a viable community even prior to emancipation. You also would have had a greater black population density, which would have allowed for more frequent social interactions after emancipation. So what you would imagine is that those particular counties where for historical reasons you had particular crops grown, those would have been the places where you would have expected the greatest potential for strong social ties to emerge. And what we want to look at is a variation across these southern counties along this dimension in the response to the new opportunities that became available. Okay, what we're going to use as our source of variation here is a variable that we call the plantation share. This is just a fraction of land that is allocated to those major plantation crops. Okay, so let me just show you a picture here. This is the American South, and these are all the different states over there and the counties. And the darker is the shading, the greater is the plantation share. So what I want you to take away from this is that there's a lot of variation here, and there's a lot of variation within states as well. So you could put in state fixed effects, and it's not going to change any of the results. In fact, all the results that I'm going to show you have state fixed effects in them. Okay. So what were the opportunities? Remember here, it's an interaction of opportunities and preconditions, right? So what were the opportunities that became available? Well, the first opportunity was essentially a political opportunity. So you have what is known as Reconstruction from 1867 to 1877. So this was the time when the federal government basically took control of the Confederate states. You have military rule over there, and so that was a time when blacks could go out to vote. They could elect their own leaders, and in fact, more than 600 blacks were elected during this period. Again, what we want to look at, of course, is the variation across the southern counties in the response to this opportunity. We're going to look at, for example, voting patterns, election of black leaders, and so forth during this time. Now, once the federal troops left in 1877, the southern whites slowly started to reassert themselves. They put into place all sorts of restrictions, and by 1900 or so, blacks were effectively disfranchised. But there is this window of time when we can look to see whether they were able to respond or not. Then you have an economic opportunity. Starting from 1916, running through 1930, you have what is known as the Great Migration. 400,000 blacks moved from the south to northern cities between 1916 and 1918, which is more than the number that moved in the preceding 40 years. Over 1 million blacks moved between 1916 and 1930, which is about 1/10 of the black population at that time. So this is one of the largest internal migrations in history. And what we want to understand is how was a community, a population that was so severely disadvantaged so recently, and how did it manage to do this kind of thing? Okay, so once again, what we want to think about is, what are the preconditions? And what we would expect to see if it's a story about sort of, community effects or social effects is a very non-linear relationship between, the source of variation that we have and the response. And the model that we write down actually says that cooperation cannot be supported below a threshold level of social cohesion. And above that, you should actually see a positive association between the level of mobilization, or therefore the level of migration, or the level of political participation, and social cohesion. The way that we measure social cohesion, as I mentioned earlier, is through this variable, what we call the orientation share. Okay? There's one additional prediction of the model, which is actually very useful for us, which is that if, in fact, variation in migration across these counties is driven by variation in underlying collective mobilization, that some places were more networked than others, then that should have implications not only for the level of migration, but also the clustering of migrants at the destination. And so if our story is correct, then the level of migration and the concentration of migrants at the destination should in fact track together. Okay, and we're going to look at that as well. This is actually very useful in ruling out alternative explanations. So now let me just show you some patterns here. So as I said, there's a very non-linear, very particular relationship that we uncovered. On the x-axis, what we have is this plantation share variable across all of our southern counties. Okay, there's about 1,100 of them. On the y-axis, what you have is the number of Republican votes. Why do we use the number of Republican votes? This was the party of the Union. So all blacks at this time would have been voting for the Republican Party. Now, of course, there would also be whites who would be voting for the Republican Party. But what we're assuming here implicitly is that there's no correlation between the number of white votes and the plantation share. And I'm going to give you some evidence along those lines in 1 second, okay? But for the moment, let's just assume that this measures black mobilization. And what you see here, despite the fact that the black population is monotonically increasing, is that in fact there's no change at all up to a threshold. And this threshold, where about 1/3 of the black population was actually to the left of this threshold. Once you cross this threshold, you start to see a steep increase. If this is in 1872. If you go to 1880, you see the same pattern, except it's a little bit weaker above the threshold. But if you get to 1900, by which point the blacks were completely disfranchised, you see nothing at all. This is suggesting for you that this change that we've seen here was driven by black voters. Now, we also have data on the probability that a black leader was elected from the county. I'm not going to show that to you today, but that tracks exactly with this pattern. So there was something going on which allowed blacks in counties above this threshold to actually come out to vote and to elect their own leaders. Now let's jump forward a few decades and look at migration. So this is now data from, these are two different measures. One is migration at the very beginning of the Great Migration, which is this line over here. And this is a measure of migration over the entire period. And this is noisier, but in fact we have a lot of statistical tests in the paper where we cannot reject that there's no association between migration up to a threshold and then an increase thereafter. And these effects are very large. If I broke up the black population into 3 equal groups, then the top third of the population would have supplied 50% of the migrants, and the bottom third would have supplied less than 15% of the migrants. So we're actually uncovering very, very large effects through this mechanism that we claim to have uncovered. Okay, this is now data from just one state. This is the state of Mississippi. The solid line over here is basically data from a different source. What I just showed you earlier was from the population census. We're using changes in the population from one census year to the next to actually back out the level of migration. What we're using here is data from from Medicare records, which are merged with Social Security data. These are details that you don't need to know. But the point is that these are 2 independent sources of data. And what you find in the state of Mississippi is that these 2 independent sources of data track very closely together, and more importantly, you get the same pattern as we got across all the southern states. You have it's basically flat up to the same threshold, and it's increasing thereafter. If you look now at the number of migrants as well as the concentration of the destination, with this new data source, we actually know where these people went. What you find is that the Herfindahl index, which is a measure of concentration at the destination, tracks perfectly with the level of migration. As I said earlier, this is exactly consistent with the model, but as the level of migration increases, it's basically driven by this underlying network. So the further you move to the right, the more network were these people, and that's why you're seeing this greater spatial concentration. If you look at the whites instead, it's basically just a flat line. There's nothing there. So let me just wrap up now, since I've given you a lot of information in a short period of time. So what I want you to take away from this is just basically 2 things. What you need for this kind of mobilization, which I think is really very, very important. not just in India, but I think in terms of the development process in general, is two things. You need the opportunity, you need the shock, and it has to be large enough to jumpstart this kind of transition. And then you need underlying preconditions that will support this. You think about what happened with the Kathiawardis. This was a group basically which had its first shock in the mid-1960s, which allowed it to move from agricultural labor into industrial labor in Surat. There were obviously other subcastes around in Gujarat who could have done the same thing. Why was it the Kathiawardis and not anybody else? Then they had a second shock in the late 1970s, which allowed them to move into the business. Why was it that the Parsis or the Sindhis didn't make that same transition at that time? It's obviously an interaction of opportunities and preconditions. And it's the same story for the blacks. You have a shock with emancipation, then you have opportunities with Reconstruction, with the Great Migration, but obviously all the black population did not respond uniformly to these opportunities. There were certain counties where, due to historical reasons, the preconditions were appropriate, which allowed them to respond and take advantage of these opportunities. And you could go one step further and think about those places in the north which would have received a bunch of people from the same southern county. Those communities would have been much more cohesive in 1920 or 1930 when they were just forming. And this would then have implications for the future sort of trajectory of those northern neighborhoods into the 20th century and perhaps even into the 21st century. And so what I'm trying to sort of convey to you here is a view of development which is almost like a process of, you have a shock, then there's some kind of response, and then you move forward in time. And understanding this kind of process, I think, is going to help us to understand how development actually occurs. And of course, once we get to that point, we can start to think about designing policy interventions that take advantage of this, where you can actually jumpstart these kinds of transitions. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kaivan. Very interesting paper. Whatever.
I think it makes sense to take questions now.
Yes, that's what I thought.
Okay.
So, Vegard will do the questions now for this one, and then probably will. So, if you have any questions on Kaivan's paper, comments, suggestions, or anything.
So, Kaivan, clearly you devote a lot of attention in your exposition to the network effects for the blacks. But with the Kathiawardis, I guess you didn't spend that much time. And I'm sure you looked at it, but in your presentation, there was nothing to indicate that this was a social network effect. Okay? So what is the evidence that you use for the network effect?
I guess I might have skipped that too far. It's always circumstantial, right? You don't observe it directly. It's the same for the blacks. But I think the point here is when you see a particular pattern like this, you want to ask yourself, what are the alternative explanations? So one alternative, why do you see this sort of intergenerational mobility in that community, and what is supporting that? And as I was saying at the very end of that part of the presentation, one way to look at that is to look at the performance of these people. So when you look at their export trajectory, what you see for the Kathiawardis is they track together with the Palampuris, despite the fact that if you look at their background, if you look at their education, it's declining over time. So there was obviously some underlying force that is allowing them to keep track. And when you put in the firm fixed effects, then in fact the Kathiawadi trajectory is significantly steeper than it is for the other communities. So what I would argue is that that's what sort of, what you're picking up there, that additional effect that you're picking up is coming from their underlying. Now, of course, we can't.
What skill you need to succeed in the diamond business? But just for the sake of argument, if there was some vocational training that may have helped people go into the diamond business, okay, and is it possible that there was some educational opportunity that all people in that community had, which enabled them to enter? That's as an alternative.
And just to kind of add to that, I'm thinking that for example, if there were any other similar communities that you could observe during that point in time, and you could show that this effect is only present for the Kathiawardis and not the others.
Well, we see that with the others, the other two industries. With the other two communities, you don't see the same effect, right?
But then they were already business communities to start with. So I'm saying that in terms of other communities that might be similar to Kathiawardis.
So well, I have a story for that actually, which is actually the stuff that Mark kind of talked about in his. So what's interesting is that Mark and I have a paper on the Maharashtrian community in Dadar, which is one area in Bombay, and this is from another area called Opera House. So they're just about 5 kilometers away from each other, maybe 7 kilometers away from each other. And in that paper, we're talking about how their traditional networks actually restricted mobility. And here's a paper in the same city around the same time where you have networks which are actually supporting mobility. And so I think if maybe that helps, to respond to what you're saying, is that it really matters, the preconditions, the context really matters enormously to actually understand what is happening. You can, yeah, so getting back to Dilip's point, I mean, maybe there was some, what I cannot rule out is that there was some change over time within the diamond industry which differentially affected the cartel lines. So because we know, for example, they were working with the small stones. So let's suppose the small stone sector suddenly became much more profitable. Then it would have supported the entry of people who are weaker and weaker at the margin. And that is something I can actually check for and control for. Anything, in fact, profits were going down in that sector over time.
So what about
but any change?
If banks moved into the area where they live?
No, where they live means where? Kathiawar? No. The other thing is, I mean, the other point was that till very recently, bank credit was, I mean, now you have lots of bank credit for the diamond industry. In the last, like 5 or 6 or 7 years. But over the period we're talking about, in fact, bank credit was very scarce. And the reason because banks didn't want to touch these guys, because you would basically have no way to deal with them, because they would just go bankrupt. So the only way they could actually get the credit, the working capital they needed, was through supplier credit. And that was the source of the networking, is that you had to go to Antwerp, you had to get these stones on supplier credit from people that you didn't know at all. And how could you possibly do that? It was only through this community network. That's the story, I think.
And so one thing that struck me in this was all of these are names of places, right? Kathiawar and,
But I think they use, you're right.
No,
but this is a lower caste
particular. Yeah, so the question is really whether, when one thinks about chamars in UP, for example, there's a very different story of mobility, and there's a lot of mobility through the political process now. There was no one really doing occupations that they valued, and so they didn't really, partly they didn't want that mobility that would occur from changes in the price of leather, changes in the market for leather, things like that. Right. I don't know the detail, but the question here is really, firstly, if it was lower caste Patels, then they're not really low caste in the same sense as we think of low caste.
No, but they were agricultural laborers and sharecroppers.
I mean, but lots of people. I mean, a lot of poor agricultural laborers across the board, including Brahmins. And so, are we really telling a story of mobility within the caste system, or are we really telling a story about mobility where the networks are spatial networks? So if it really was Kathiawar, that was, if we're really thinking of Kathiawaris as from Kathiawar, and that being a large, somewhat diverse group, then really is the network a caste network, or do you feel confident of that, or could it be a spatial network?
No, it is a caste network. So if there really were a variety of subcastes all from Kathiawar, I don't think you'd be seeing them all marrying each other. Whereas in the paper, I mean, we look at that very carefully, and over 90% or 92% of the, forget the entrepreneurs themselves, but their children marry within the.
And so, what size would they be in Kathiawar? What would they?
What number?
What size?
I mean,
so
I don't know about the Kathiawar. Is that my sense of these subcastes, and I know more about Tamil Nadu actually for some reason than Western India. But I would say like 300,000 would be kind of in my head is the number that I have for the size of a subcaste. So it's very large, right? I mean, it's not a small marriage market in a sense. So it's large enough to support this, but at the same time, it's so big that you really need very strong ties to keep some kind of cohesion in place. And that's what comes over generations, right? If you're marrying all the time, I think you can really support this kind of commitment.
So it's only one jati within that?
Yes, absolutely.
Kaivan, are there some industry-specific things which basically prohibit entry of other castes or other people?
For sure,
some kind of
so here's the thing, actually, Dilip knows this as well. I'm very actually.
That I think is where, I mean.
Don't get me wrong, this is not a representative industry.
Yeah, so they're very secretive about allowing entry of anybody else in this particular system.
Yeah,
that is also to do with the
nature of the business.
Nature of the business. I think that's something which is very, very
this is a very, when you say, are there really networks, I mean, everyone knows that communities tells you obviously something is going on. But at the same time, I would not argue that this is somehow so different that it doesn't happen elsewhere. I think something that's really important for us to understand is what is happening now with the rapidly changing Indian economy. What is the background of these new entrepreneurs? Where are they coming from? How are they moving into business? Are they using, there's this very fascinating book by someone called Harish Damodar. I don't know if you know about this. It's a really nice book, which is, he's a journalist who talks about this kind of transition that has happened. He talks about different communities in North, and he said for some reason in North India you actually have less for some reason. I don't know what the story is, but you see much more of that in South India. So for example, Abhijit Banerjee and I have this old paper on Tirupur, where you have these Gaunders who were traditionally farmers. Now those are rich farmers, they were landowners, who basically moved from agriculture into the garment industry. So I have no doubt that right now, at a time like this, and again this gets to what Mark was saying, this is the kind of time when these kinds of, when human capital matters and when social capital matters. And you have to believe that this is happening as we speak. We just don't know about it, because all this happens under the surface. So if you actually had information about this, I'm sure you would find particular groups occupying particular niches in the industry, which we just don't know about.
Yeah, I mean, that's why the question is that now that you mentioned Tirupur particularly, and this is how do you look at it, the whole process of transition. This is the role that the networks are playing. Tirupur is particularly important in understanding this. The Dalits are basically appointed by the Dalits. The other castes are appointed by the, in this sense, majority of them work in the same factories. And that is not necessarily because they are using the advantages of the community and network, but because it's easier for them to exploit the same community background. In the sense, when you come to the urban network, you are probably unconnected. You don't have any other assets in that sense. Probably you are, and you find it much more easier to work with the same community person. But that sense makes it more vulnerable for you, because then you are completely dependent on that guy to basically provide you employment, give you back to your family. In a sense, how do you look at it? In a sense, not according to the industry specific as such, but the occupational issue, the caste issue that Rohini was mentioning, because the experiences of different castes, in that sense, have been basically both in this diamond kind of industry, also in the what Harish Damodharan is talking about, but a large majority of the mobility has been because of the other advantages that comes with communities networks. You call it advantages or disadvantages, it's up to you to interpret. It create barriers for entry of other people who otherwise would have possessed the same kind of qualifications, or probably what Dilip was talking about in that sense.
Absolutely. So
how do you see it as positive or negative?
Yeah, but there is, we know that, right? The Patels, for example, with those motels in the US, those are all from, in fact, these are not these Patels. Those are actually from another part. They are near, actually, it's a Kheda district. They're from
But
Chiragaon.
they're also from Uganda. They were pushed out, right?
But that's a different group. The ones from Uganda went a long time ago, was indentured. That's a different group, exactly. So they're all different. But if you go, for example, to Kenya, I did a project in Kenya, and someone put me in touch with the local Gujarati community, and I'm Parsi, so I speak Gujarati. But their Gujarati I could not even understand it, because it's the Gujarati from 2 generations ago. So it's quite incredible, actually, the strength of these kinds of community ties. But yeah.
Good question.
Yeah. Could this be right? So obviously, there's something else going on.
Any questions on the second part of the presentations, not on the India part?
We should also be moving along.
Yeah. If there is one question or any question on that, because that I think there is not been any.
Using control for, were allowed, let me ask you a question. Were blacks allowed to own property in all the states, or were there state level variation in
Property?
Or farm?
No, they could own farms everywhere. I mean, at least technically. There was one, after emancipation, right?
Right.
Yeah, that was not a problem. But of course, they could have varied. In fact, if you look in the data, most of them would have been agricultural laborers. So in fact, many of those structures that were in place prior to emancipation, they just remain in place. If you even look at, for example, the black population, the correlation in the black population between 1860 and 1890, for example, is at 0.85. So nothing really changed. You still had large farms. They just weren't technically called a plantation with a white owner, but it was still a white owner running everything as it was, right? Things didn't really change so much. But the point is, nevertheless, you see this kind of response. And that's what is most striking, is that if you think the Kathiawardis are disadvantaged, I mean, this is an extremely disadvantaged population. So, yeah.
Thanks, Kaivan. We'll move to the next presentation. That's by Jeremy. Jeremy.
So the sort of motivating slide for this, and the benchmark that we're building off of, is that by now we know that social networks are an important way that people find jobs. And we know this because if you ask people how they find jobs, they say it through a social network. In case you don't believe that, there's by now a large body of literature that looks at plausibly exogenous shocks to network size or quality that always seems to find that when your network gets bigger or better off, your labor market outcomes improve. And finally, the sort of reasons that have been identified theoretically for this is that networks solve a couple of convenient problems. One is that job information originates at plants where everyone already works. And so networks might do a nice job spreading that information out to workers who don't work there yet. The other is that we might know some things about our friends and relatives that might be useful information for employers that it's very difficult to credibly convey on a resume, and so networks can help screen on behalf of employers. So that's what we know already, and as I said, I think we know quite well by now. What we don't know, and what we don't know very much about at all, is how exactly this job referral process takes place. And so it's nice to talk about networks like they're giant, ambiguous things that are hard to define, but at the end of the day, it's a collection of people that each have their own incentives. And so when a piece of job, when the opportunity to make a referral enters a network, we have to sort of wonder how does the person who gets that opportunity make the decision who to share the job opportunity with. And so there's a lot in theory which maybe doesn't deal with incentives all the time, but there's some tremendously complex network theory that sort of has some predictions for what should happen as a result of networks allocating jobs. That really there's a big gap in the empirical literature. The sort of things that we can usually find plausibly exogenous variation tend not to be able to inform on these kinds of questions. They also tend not to be able to inform on things like these theoretical mechanisms, on what happens with the spread of information, can networks screen. And if we want to do more than just say that networks matter, we need to know a lot more. And in particular, if we want to know who's going to benefit from the fact that networks are being used, we need to know how networks decide to organize referrals. If we want to know even a really basic question like do job networks end up identifying good employees? Are they capable of screening? Then we need to know more than just that networks are what's in place today. So we're going to focus on that, the most basic question we can really think of about networks, which is, are networks can networks screen and will they in practice? And so there's sort of two mechanisms by which people have identified that networks might screen. The first is assortative matching. So good employees might know other people, might only hang out with other people who would be good employees, in which case all you have to do is give the opportunity to a good employee to make a referral, and he'll take care of the rest by himself without trying. Now it seems like a fairly strong assumption, and so there's a possibility that good employees know some good employees, but also know some bad ones. And in that case, if networks are going to screen on behalf of employers, the people in networks both have to sort of know which of their friends would be good and which would be bad employees, and also want to use that information. And the first might be a good guess, although again we don't have any empirical knowledge on that thus far. The second, I think, should be really controversial. And the reason it should be controversial is that networks don't exist for the purpose of allocating jobs, at least for the most part. Most of the time when we talk about networks in developing countries, we talk about the role of networks in insuring each other against idiosyncratic risk. What that means is that when a good opportunity enters your network, it's entering a contracting system where people have contingent claims on good opportunities. And there's relatively little reason to believe, I think, that the person with the strongest contingent claim on the next job opportunity is likely to be the best fit for any particular job. On top of that, there's this possibility that we actually like the people that we know. And if we actually like the people that we know, then what that means is that when you hear about a job from your employer, you're going to trade off whatever incentive your employer provides you with to reverse someone good against the fact that you know your no good brother-in-law really needs work and you'd really like to see him succeed. So what that means is that there's, I think, very good reason to think that employees won't always choose the best person from the firm's perspective because whatever incentives the firm can provide are going to be strongly challenged by these underlying social incentives. I'm not going to talk about the last one. Okay, so today, what we're interested in this experiment is are some or all workers able to identify good matches from among their network members? And if so, does their willingness to identify these good matches depend on financial incentives? And we'll ask two things about how financial incentives might change the type of people that get referred. We'll ask whether they change the type of relationships that people bring into a job, so whether they cause people to stop bringing in relatives, for example, and we'll ask whether they change the productivity of people that get referred to a job. So how do we ask these questions? These are difficult things to ask in general because we usually don't observe the full incentive structure that's existent in a workplace. So what we did is we ran a laboratory experiment in the field in a not-so-great neighborhood of Kolkata. And the basic idea behind all of this is that once we have people come into our lab and do some task and pay them money, we've given them a day job. Not a very good day job, but a day job all the same. And so once they've had that, we can sort of ask them to refer someone else into our lab. We can randomly vary their incentives to refer someone who's going to be a strong lab participant. And we'll be able to see who they actually refer. And what's really nice about this is that while we're measuring something in a lab, what we're actually interested in is what happens when people go out into the real world. They stop and they make the decision about who to bring into our lab. Sure.
I'm just wondering, so the person who was referred got a job only for 1 day, right?
That's right.
So I mean, I'm not sure how a referral would matter. I would think that a referral or a 50-50 chance, you know, let me pick this guy and hopefully he's an able worker, would work, that strategy would work fine for a 1-day contract as opposed to a contract that maybe you have to, you know, you are forced to, you know, employ him for a certain duration of time, which makes it even more important that you get the right person in the right place.
So what we're going to do is we're going to be paying, when you make this referral, we're going to pay you some money if your referral performs well. So that's not exactly the same as the type of long-run reputational incentive that you have to refer someone who's going to fill a permanent position at a high quality for a long period of time. But on the other hand, neither are the sort of social payments you would get for referring your no-good brother-in-law to a high-qualified position for a long period of time. So in a sense, what we're doing is we're looking at that precise question, but we're looking at it with the incentive scale down quite a ways. So to be a 1-day problem versus a lifetime problem. But as I said, I think both the competing social incentives and the sort of employer-employee incentives are both being scaled down, and it's maybe not obvious what would happen when they both scaled up. Okay, so what's our experiment? Round one, what happens is we recruit some people randomly, we go door to door, and every third house we invite someone to send a participant in. Once they come in, we pay them, they come in because we offer them 135 rupees for about 2 hours of time, doing not so difficult work. How much is 135 rupees for the sample? Well, the average daily income is about 110 rupees, so this is a pretty good day's wage. They come in, they complete a survey, and then they're randomly assigned to 1 or 2 tasks. One emphasizes cognitive skills, which is basically some thinly veiled logic puzzles, and the other emphasizes pure effort, which is where we have them make little baggies of 20 peanuts each for half an hour. Today we're going to focus on the cognitive task, and we're going to do that because, as I'll show you in a second, nearly all of the sample is there. After we pay them, we offer them a finder's fee of at least a certain amount to bring in someone who will be good at the task they just did, and we ask them to find a high-quality referral. How do we randomize? Well, we randomize between 5 different payment categories. Three of these 5 are fixed payment categories, so we either offered you a fixed finder's fee of 60 rupees, 80 rupees, or 110 rupees. The other 2 are performance incentives. So we offered them, if they were in the low-stakes performance incentives, they were offered at least 60 rupees, but if their referral did well enough, they would make up to 80. If they were in the high stakes, they would be offered at least 60 rupees, but if their referral did well enough, they'd make up to 110. And in both cases, we specifically specified the exact nature of the contract. So if the referral solves 2 puzzles correctly, you get a certain amount. If they solve 3, you get a certain amount as well. Okay, so what happens in round 2? After people go out to choose their referrals, they come back to our lab. People in performance-based treatments are told they'll actually be paid the maximum. We didn't want to find ourselves in a situation where I'm going to use the word OP, sorry, but the first people we brought in our original participants are OPs. It's because if you use referee and referral, you start saying the same word over and over again after a while. So the OPs, we were really worried that the OPs would just split their finder's fee with their referral, in which case OPs and performance treatments, the referrals of those OPs would have a private incentive to try harder. So what they're told is actually good news, you'll get the top pay ratings that we promised you in any event. Referrals then complete the survey, they perform both tasks, and while they do this, we have OPs complete an interim survey and have a cup of tea. And the important thing about the interim survey is we ask them how strong of a referral did you make? How well do you expect your referral to do? What is this cognitive task we're going to talk about? We asked them to help us design a quilt, and what that involved was that we gave them several different swatches of differently colored squares and asked to arrange in a pattern. So the most simple was you had 16 swatches, 4 each of 4 different colors, and they had to arrange them in a grid so that there was exactly 1 of each color in 1 of each row, 1 of each color in every row and every column. Then they got a little more complicated. We observed some information on that will normalize into a z-score. It's not too important for this. And finally, because we didn't want people just to tell the referrals the answers to the puzzle, we randomly selected 2 different sets of very analogous puzzles across days. It doesn't look like there was much information convention on this slide, but let me know. Okay, so in the interest of time, randomization worked for the most part. There's marginal imbalance on one variable, which is what you would expect out of 10 variables, and so it sort of looks about right. A few notes on the sample. Who are we working with here? They're young. Their average age is about 30, and a third of them are between 18 and 25. Only a third are household heads, and basically all are literate. So what you should think of is that basically households are sending their adult sons in to participate in our lab. But what's important for this is that over 90% of them are employed, and over 80% are the primary earner in their household. So the people who are coming in are the sort of real-world labor market participants that you would recruit into an actual job. So as an outline of what the analysis does, I'm only going to actually present one table in the interest of time. But we look at several different characteristics. First, and we present a model in the paper that I'm also going to skip in the interest of time. But the model, I'll say 2 words on the model, or 1 sentence. So what the model basically sets up is that these OPs who come into our lab face a choice. And they face a choice between whether they want to return with a referral, and if they decide to return with a referral, who they want to bring in. And so from among their friends, each of their friends will have some actual ability level. They're going to have an ability level that the OP perceives about them. So the OP is going to receive a signal of their ability level, and they're going to have some social payment that they'll give the OP if the OP chooses them. So from those 3 predictions, the OP both makes 2 decisions. He makes a decision of whether to return, and if he returns, who to bring in. And we derive from that several predictions. First, participation sensitivity. When we provide performance incentives, if one group decides to return into the lab more than other groups, that's going to be an indication that that group faces a higher expected return to that performance incentive, which is another way of saying that they believe their signals to convey more information. Second, fixed fee sensitivity. Fixed fees might affect the participation decision, but they shouldn't affect which referral you choose, conditional on deciding to come in. And I'm not going to show you this table, but empirically that seems to be upheld. There are absolutely no differences across different fixed fee wage groups in what types of referrals come in on any dimension we can measure. Finally, the more important part of the model, the trade-off between these social and professional incentives. So if these OPs have some information and are deciding to return to the lab, they should respond to these performance incentives by bringing in people that they think are better, which means trading off these social incentives, so we should expect them to bring more distant relations. Secondly, if they have information, they might respond to performance incentives by bringing in better workers. And it's not on the slide, but it should be. There's actually several necessary conditions for this to happen. They need to have information. If they change their behavior in response to performance incentives, they need to not want to use that information. In other words, they need to get the highest social payment from somebody who they don't believe to be very high quality. And thirdly, they have to know people. They have to have heterogeneous networks. They have to know people who they believe to be high quality and people they believe not to. Come on, really? I'm going to take that. So 70% of our OPs are returning with a referral. There's sort of 2 ways to view this as a test of the model. Groups with more information and performance payment treatments are going to be more likely to return. And empirically, this is actually what we observe. High ability, high incentivized OPs are more likely to return with a referral than others. I'll come back to this several times, but we basically see a number of pieces of evidence that these are the guys that have more information. Importantly, this might bias our referral choice estimation. And so we do a Heckman model. What's nice about our Heckman models normally get slaughtered in seminars because people don't have good exclusion restrictions. And in this case, I think we actually do. What we have is that essentially, when it rains in Calcutta, it really rains. And during OPs that were supposed to return in 3-day windows, they come into our lab much less often. On the other hand, when it's raining in Calcutta, it may make you not want to come into our lab, but it really shouldn't affect your ability to solve logic puzzles. So I think we have a pretty strong exclusion restriction. I'm not going to talk about functional form sensitivity, but it really looks like it's not there in the sense that we've done what you can. Okay. So as I said, we're looking for 2 trade-offs. We're looking for a trade-off on social incentives and a trade-off on ability. We're looking to see if social incentives decline and ability increases. What we see empirically is essentially 2 things. First, in terms of social incentives, what we can measure is how you're related to your referral. And so in particular, we have two groups that we can really isolate, relatives and coworkers. 35% of gifts in our sample come from relatives, and so do most loans. Almost none come from coworkers, so it really looks like relatives are closer social relations, as you might expect. And indeed, what we find is that when we provide high-stakes performance payments, all OPs bring in about 8 percentage points more coworkers and about 7 percentage points fewer relatives, and that's a 50% swing in the relative fraction. So it really looks like they're moving towards more socially distant people. What's interesting about this is that despite this movement, and this is the only table of percent, there's actually no average increase in performance. These high and low stakes performance-based treatment group categories, you can't see these if you're out of the first two rows, but there's no difference in the actual performance of their referral across them. What's interesting, column 3 adds a control for OP test scores, and higher ability OPs do bring in referrals who perform better on our test. But what's interesting is that that difference is completely driven by these high ability OPs who are in high stakes performance payment treatments, and they bring in OPs who are referrals who are much better. And so what we are seeing is that these high ability OPs in high stakes performance payment treatments bring in referrals who perform much, much stronger on the test. And what that's telling us is both that they can identify these people, but they'd rather not, because they aren't when they don't have high stakes performance. Actually, we'll finish in 3 minutes. Or close to. So basically what we saw is that everyone responded to incentives by shifting who they bring in. Only the high ability guys actually brought in referrals who perform better. One thing this is consistent with is if low ability OPs were not able to predict the performance of their referral. It's also conditional, which would also be consistent with the fact that these high ability OPs responded to our performance payment treatments by returning to the lab more frequently. We actually have one more piece of evidence which is a bit more direct, which is a measure of how accurate their predictions of their referral performance was. And what we see is that for high ability OPs, there was a tremendously strong correlation between what they thought their referral would do and what the referral actually did. And for low ability OPs, there was no correlation whatsoever. So it really looks like one of the big differences is that high ability OPs see some accurate signals of how strongly their friends and relatives will perform. Low ability OPs seem not to. Okay, so just to conclude, what we did using a lab experiment, but measuring things that happen outside of our lab, is that people who are offered performance pay are more likely to recruit coworkers and less likely to recruit relatives. And high ability people recruit high ability referrals, but they only do so when they're incentivized, which means that they can do it, but that they don't want to. And so what this provides is the evidence that networks, or at least high ability members, can exploit information about their peers' capability. It also suggests that with the right incentives, you can overcome these social incentives, which ex ante I wasn't sure we would find. But with 50 rupees, which is, again, it's a 100% increase in the amount of the performance, your take-home wins for making a referral, you can overcome what the referral will make in that process. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy.
How does an employer do by getting a random draw, right? As opposed to employing somebody who is referred by high performing guys. So was that implicit in one of the tables, or is that something that you didn't actually try to
How would the employer do by getting a random draw as opposed to?
So you use your initial distribution of people you recruited door to door and kind of put some cost of recruiting on that and saying this is what I get versus what you would need to do to go through that work.
So, but the point estimate is that they're better. They aren't better than the referrals of these high ability incentivized guys.
Right.
Those guys beat the initial guys,
right.
But the average referral does not beat, and it does not.
Right. But in some sense, what you were doing was you weren't wanting to get referrals from people who you know are not that good, right? So the point here is from an optimizing firm's perspective, would it make sense to use the networks as opposed to go through an IIT recruiting process? And I think that's what I'm getting at. It looks like the answer would be yes, because if you're optimizing.
If you optimize it based on
the answer is no, because the initial lot performs better.
Yeah. No, on average.
On average.
But if you're optimizing and referrals from it.
So if you chose only referrals from your high performers and if for solving logic puzzles, but yeah, I think that's right. Although I haven't run that. I don't remember having run that exact thing, so I can't promise you that that's what we find. Yeah, but it's an interesting interpretation.
Any other questions?
You have a job for 1 day. How many people might have done?
The initial rupees, we expect it will take about 2 hours of your time.
For what?
Yeah, so what did we say? It's a good question. We definitely said that it wasn't very strenuous work, but we didn't give them specifics on what exactly they were coming in for.
No, but if something is told by informal sector labor, there is poverty, action, some sort of this, and it will be completely confused. So I mean, it's not laboratory, not computer science, not what it is. So I'd just like to know what was the real agenda put forward before plan?
Then we need 2 hours of your, we think it'll take 2 hours of your time. But as I said,
they might have an opportunity cost of going somewhere and working as a labor, isn't it?
that's absolutely right.
And
if they did,
I would also want to know the timing when it was done, because most, if it is semi-urban Kolkata, most of the people leave early morning in the local trains to go to Kolkata.
Well, so that these were all in one neighborhood in Kolkata. All of our 2 neighborhoods.
Yeah,
yeah. You want to answer the question?
Well, I mean, I think there are several questions here. I mean, so the answer is that we went door to door a few days in advance and left a coupon saying, please send someone with this coupon into our lab. We're going to pay 135 rupees for about 2 hours of your time. Our lab is here. You can send anyone who's an adult male between 18 and 60.
Generally, the question that I think is, do you have information on what these guys were doing otherwise, in a sense?
Oh, yeah, we have that information.
You have that information?
Yeah.
That information, and did it play any role in, did you see the correlation between what they were doing earlier and the kind of task that you were using as your, your test, in the sense?
So there are some that
what they were doing.
the occupations, I mean, this may have to do with how you categorize occupations.
Yeah, for example, on the cognitive test, in which is there, but somebody who is, or for example, on the physical test, and somebody who is doing a physical manual labor or probably doing some filling, unfilling kind of a loading kind of thing, would have an advantage over that.
Yeah.
So do you find that kind of a pattern? That's what the question is.
So there aren't many
probably
people
what he's hinting at is that the kind of people who participated in your test were people who normally would not be employed anywhere else, and probably were available for this kind of and didn't have that much of a.
No, that's right. So these people all were employed elsewhere. As I said, over 95% are employed, and over 80% are the primary earner for their household. What they're employed in, there's a broad variety of manual labor of various sorts, other types of occupations also. There's actually quite a wide range, and we haven't been able to characterize it in a simple way, so we haven't tried. There are some interesting anecdotes. For example, we had one guy who came in whose job actually was to make little baggies of peanuts, and he did very well at that. But in general, there was quite a pretty
nobody who was doing puzzles who came to your test.
There was a video game on the air in Kolkata at this time period where they solved similar puzzles, and so we may have gotten some fans of that video game. Yeah.
Okay. So one last human subjects, you have to get the clarification. So I have one quick question about it. The fact that you were really observing something that that was not what was told. Your real interest was referral, whereas the subjects were told that they would be participating in a study which would look at their jobs and everything. Was there any issues in getting those clarifications? Is that ever stem up, or is it just a technical thing?
Yeah, no. So it's in the one thing. The one point that both of our IRBs were interested in, our human service bureaus, was this point that we actually paid them more than we paid them the maximum range of their contract rather than according to the specific details of their contract. And that was something they were interested in. So what we did is we had them in the consenting process, we had them actually sign a form saying we might pay you more than we say here, but we're going to. And unsurprisingly, that wasn't too controversial. So they had, otherwise than that, it went through.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. We now move to Biznor. Yeah, we are moving to Biznor. Vegard is going to give us.
So it's good to be back. I come here most of the time anyway. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to talk about not experimental labor markets, but real labor markets. And I'm going to talk, there's sort of been some suggestions already that migration is an important area to study. And what I want to look at is some in-depth evidence on network mechanisms and social ties in markets for low and unskilled jobs among migrants from Western Europe. This is joint work with a person who should also have been here, but who messed up on his thesis. We know that social networks are important for labor market entry in South Asia. Kaivan and Magruder find that about when it comes to low and unskilled jobs, blue-collar jobs in Dada, around 70% of such jobs are found through a referral. The referral there is a bit vaguely defined in my view, but we'll go with the estimate. It's a high figure. Chain migration also has a long and distinguished history in the subcontinent. Nice books by Zachariah, who's at CDS now retired, and by Biswajit Banerjee in 1983, very interesting and early and pioneering study. What we know is also that social clusters in Indian industries and workplaces are very common. What we don't know so much about is how these clusters and why such clusters are formed, and why employers may benefit from social connections among members of the workforce. Those of you who are familiar with much of the recent and innovative work in applied labor economics will know that Bandera and others have done some very nice work where they sort of identify the impact of social incentives on labor productivity. Okay, the theoretical backdrop here is that we know that if you look at the economic literature, there's a bit of propensity to focus when it comes to labor market networks on job search and information dispersion. And this, if you think about networks essentially as a sort of vehicles for spreading information about vacancies, then the policy implications are not so hard. It means that you just have to put in place better mechanisms for spreading informational jobs that may be available for people. Much less attention, as I already said, to how social connections may remedy, among members of the workforce, may remedy the information screening and enforcement problems. Moral hazard, confronting, urban and other employers. I'm dropping the discussion of Kaivan here. If we sort of think about various types of network mechanisms, Jeremy has already talked about employee referrals, and that's something that we're going to look at here also, because it turns out that in the data set that we have, workplace entry to an insider is very common. And I'm going to give you sort of hints about how common it is and who the sort of intermediaries here are, and some other things too. One of the recent papers in this literature focuses on what they describe as social collateral within networks. And this is an issue that kind of is touched upon already in Kugler in 2003, whereby a referee or someone taking a new recruit into a workplace can reduce monetary costs by exerting social pressure on that person. But the problem with Kalan is, Kalan and others, it should be here, is that they focus on behavioral risks or moral hazard only in the relationship between the employer and the intermediary. So this is between the employer and the employee middleman. In the relationship between the employee middleman and the recruit, there is no moral hazard, it's just adverse selection. What we try to do here in a much more simplified way than what is done in a parallel paper that I've been doing with Amrita, is to adjust Parental for this anomaly, and I have a very simple version of it here, which is very intuitive, so I'm just going to flick through it very fast, and then I'm going to show you some interesting data from this study area. Okay, so suppose that there's an expected gross surplus from hiring a worker in the labor market. It's just R, and the P is the fraction of high productivity labor workers in the market, and the rest comes with that. And suppose that if the employer selects a middleman from the current workforce to recruit a new person, we assume, and really simplify here, that the employer is certain that this employee will deliver a high quality recruit. So there is a surplus here, so we call R star from referral, which is equal to the certain outcome here, which is OH, minus the expected surplus from hiring. So the gain, the surplus from referral is R star. Here we assume also that the new recruit receives W, which is the wage rate, plus a share of the surplus, alpha, where alpha is between 0 and 1, and is the recruit's bargaining power vis-a-vis the employer. Now, for this to become interesting, and this is sort of one of the things that we focus on here, and where we see that the data give us some leverage, is that for the in-house referee, the relationship to the employer is at stake in this decision, right? So if I'm an employee middleman here and bring in someone who's not performing very well, this can be very costly. And this is something that, if you talk to people who've been acting as referees in many types of firms in India, this is something that they're really concerned about. So this is important. There is a stake here, and let's just suppose that the value of this stake is T. Now the problem here, which creates a sort of room for referee optimism, is that a low quality worker, we have an incentive to bribe the in-house referee, and the max that he's willing to pay is that the surplus he would get over the wage rate, which is simply equal to this alpha R star. The problem then for the employer is that he can only trust the in-house referee fully if the stakes involved for the in-house referee, T is larger than this alpha R star. This is a very sort of minimalist way of putting things, but it works. Okay, so the moral hazard story here, which is what we do that Kaivan simply overlooked. Suppose now that this new recruit can earn a rent R star from shirking, and this sort of shirking here, I don't like the term really because it's not a very accurate description of the types of underperformance that employers may be concerned about in the Indian context. Okay, and this is of course something that Jeremy misses out on in his daytime job example, because there are a number of issues in employer-employee relationships that are quite particular and that you sort of get a good sense of if you read some of the early anthropology on industrial labor in the Indian context. There's a very nice book by Malcolm Ström on Bombay from 1984, and it's wonderfully rich on incentive problems that employers try to tackle. And that goes from trying to prevent workers from taking part in industrial action, absenteeism levels. If you talk to factory owners in and around Delhi, the daily absenteeism may be in the 15–20% range. You never know who's going to show up. These are very high figures, and you need sort of mechanisms for trying to tackle that, and sometimes these social mechanisms can do the job and deliver what is needed more cheaply than monitoring. Okay, so let's move on with the moral hazard story. There's a Q here, which is the risk of being caught if you shirk. Epsilon is the direct cost of shirking. Rho is the weight the recruit places on referee welfare, and that's important. And then C is the cost imposed on the recruit by the referee. Now what we assume, and this is critical, is that C and Rho are increasing in S, and that's the strength of the social tie between the referee and the recruit. So the more closely related these people are, or the stronger this social tie is, the more costly shirking becomes for the workers. Okay, so this essentially gives us three predictions. One is that workplace referral, employee referral and workplace referral should be widespread, should be very common. The other is that employers should select in-house referees that have high stakes. Okay, if you don't have a high stake here, the risk of referee optimism, sorry, I have to try to speak fast, doesn't always manage. The risk of referee optimism is higher, and also referees, in order to ensure that there is compliance on the part of the new recruits, have to select people who care sufficiently about the welfare of the referees. So that sort of means that strong social ties should be observed. So a little bit more on Kaivan and company. They focus on social stakes. We include workplace stature here. T. We focus on recruit performance. They focus on exogenous traits. And this prediction 3 is orthogonal to Kaivan et al. Because they suggest that entry into low and unskilled jobs should occur through weak social ties. Okay, so Bijnor is up here. What's nice about Bijnor is that there's very rich sociological literature on it, so we have lots to build on when starting. What we did to start with is a small sample. That's sort of the big disadvantage, and there are many other things you can criticize us for, but we have some very interesting and in-depth data, and that's very good. So in terms of purposive selection here of the villages, that was because we wanted to have a mix of social compositions within the villages themselves. Because migration patterns and other types of entry may be very different across social groups in Western UP, and that's one of the things that the sociological literature tells us. So what we have here is essentially 287 individuals with labor migration experience. We have sort of complete accounts of their education and labor market histories, and we have managed to pin down or track almost 91% of all the migrants.
Just a question.
Yeah, sure.
So migrated in the last 1 year or migrated
No,
any time?
No, it's over a long time.
Over a long time.
So this is the period of time. Okay, so this stretches from the 1950s to date. There's no reason to read particular trends into it because we've lost a number of migrants on the way. But this is the time stretch. That's what I'm trying to show of the first migrant jobs of these people in this data set. Okay, what's interesting here is this something that I've done lots of work on child labor migration before, but it was not planned here, but it just stared us in the face. And a lot of these migrants at their first migrant job, very, very young. You can see that yourself from this. So we get actually 31.6% were 14 years and below, and the bakery sector absorbed around 67% of these very young migrants. And that's completely irrelevant. Okay, so what's interesting here is, one thing that's very interesting is if you look at this by social groups, okay? Because when you mentioned Shamars earlier, here, the main sort of biggest group in these villages are Ansari Muslims. Okay, and these Ansaris were traditionally weavers. Okay, that's the traditional occupation. What's happened here, and sort of I'm going to focus on that rather than these other features that we see, is that if you look at the first sector of employment in migration, it's all bakers. 82% of these Ansari migrants cluster in bakery jobs. Okay, if you look at Shamars, construction and agriculture is the biggest in the sample, and for others, which are Jats and others sort of groups of slightly higher stature in terms of social status, it's skilled private sector jobs. Rune mentioned that there wasn't much evidence on occupational mobility of Shamars, but if you stretch this out and look at it over time, there is quite a bit of change that has taken place. I'm not going to talk about that now, but just let me mention that in terms of the Ansaris, if you compare the Ansaris and the Shamars, you've had a very strong sectoral concentration amongst Ansaris over time. There's a spread out in the sectors that Shamars move into. But if you look at destinations, and this is very interesting, the early destination amongst Ansaris stretch from East India, move gradually towards the west, and then it sort of ends up in the cities in Maharashtra. That's the sort of the latest, Mumbai and Pune. For the Shamars, what you see over time is that first migrant jobs are always remain fairly local. There isn't that much spread here in destinations, but there is a diversification in sectors. So there is a change out of these construction and agriculture jobs and to other type of jobs which involve more skill acquisition and so forth. Okay, how am I doing on time? Very badly, as usual. Okay, so I'm returning now to these three theoretical predictions. I'm going to give you some nice descriptives. And I'm just going to skip this one. I'm just going to show you that there's a very high incidence of prearranged jobs here. Okay, so people have jobs before they 61.3% of the labor market entry in this sample into first migrant job happened through a workplace insider. Okay, so you go into a workplace, you end up in a workplace where you already know someone who's there. What we call indirect entry is a sort of a more indirect network mechanism, but it's still sort of very network-based, and if you include this in the first migrant jobs, you get up to 80%. Labor contractors matter, but they are relatively small, and they are sort of very strongly related to agricultural jobs, and therefore on the decline, which of course against the sort of general story in India. And if you look at sort of traditional search that we read about in the economic literature, there's very little of it. But there are some spot markets in some of these destinations for labor that people know. Okay. So remember now that we had this sort of strong type prediction here, strong social type prediction. So what type of relation in referral do people have to the referee? Well, about 30% member of the same household. usually father, son. Other relative, that's a sort of a potential trap here in the Indian context, because relatives are terms that are used very liberally, but it amounts to another 50%. So if you look at what you normally would call strong social ties here, the sort of the first migrant job, it's almost 80% of these migrants. Then there are village friends, acquaintances, so forth. Okay, other relative, what are the largest categories here? And we are very careful in how we have recorded these other relatives. Cousins, 32, uncles, 30, and brother-in-laws are the most common. Okay, so these are really sort of relatives, genuine, and they are not too distant. Now, what about this issue about employers inviting employees with high stakes to recruit on their behalf? Do we have any evidence of that? Well, here's a sort of the type of jobs that people have either moved into, or the type of jobs that the referee had when it's underlined. There's a very large sort of range, but most of these jobs are in the bakery sector. There's a nice sort of line of skills that are being acquired, and there's also quite a lot of private sector jobs. Okay, so let's look at this. This is what we, sorry, I need to say something about this. The whole point of this table, of course, is that we try to rank jobs according to sort of some prestige indicator, right? So on top is enterprise owner, which is not very carefully defined, because it captures everything from small to large enterprises. And then we go down by skill level. Some of this will have to, you can criticize 3 or 4 whether it should be there or there. Then it's vendors in the middle, which are people who are running their small single enterprises. Then there's apprentice, trainee, and then there's at the bottom here, really sort of hard manual work. Okay. So what type of jobs do people move into, and what sort of jobs do their referees have? Okay, so if you look at the contacts that people rely upon to get these jobs, you can see that there's first of all, there's a very large category of the owners that matter here. And if you look down here to category 4, that's a large percentage of the sample. The 5s are the vendors, so they are important too, but there are very few towards the end here. Okay, what does this mean? Think about it a little bit more carefully. If you have a vacancy within a firm, right, and you believe that what networks do for you is to spread information about such vacancies, then you would imagine, or you would at least expect, that for people who come from the countryside with a limited skill base, these are the type of connections that they should rely upon to get the jobs that we should see that they are moving into very soon. Okay? Yeah, tell me. Time. Okay, fine. I'll be quick. Okay. So what's yeah? Just let me say one thing, because we had owners here. Owners recruitment: 31% recruited a household member, and another 43% a relative. This means that when it comes to social ties to recruits, employee referees act very similarly to the owners of the firm when it comes to the use of social ties. Okay, so what type of jobs do people move into here? Totally the bottom of the line. I mean, this is where it starts out. Very hard and very unglamorous existence, right? And this, since we know that they're getting into such jobs, we would imagine that the type of contact they relied upon, if there was a sort of an information dispersion story here, would be very similar, but it's not. It's completely different. Okay, I'm just going to sort of, this is the information, this is the sort of the main reliable explanation that we have been working on. And I think we have very, very good reasons to say that this is certainly not what's going on here. Insiders have privileged access to vacancy information. There are no signs of it. Not at the level that these people move into. We know that there's a very high prevalence of referral amongst younger migrants. Here, 74.4% for those below 14, 54.3% for those above. Suggests to me at least that there's an insurance dimension to referral, which is sheltering young migrants. What I mean is that if you're a parent sending a young migrant somewhere, you make sure that this person gets into a workplace where there is already someone working that you know. That provides some safety for these young kids. Okay, a couple of other alternative explanations. Preferences for working together could be there. We have tried to test for this. We don't find much evidence of it. And there could be screening going on. We find some screening in what we've done, but not very much. Okay, so what I want to propose here, and this is sort of, I'm not showing you these regressions because I got a little bit of what shall we call it? In English football, they call it the Ferguson hairdryer, which is the halftime talk when Manchester United are not doing very well. So I got a bit of criticism. But anyway, what is important to notice here is that not only are connections to work for these first migrant jobs, these are first migrant jobs, not only are connections to workplace insiders necessary, insiders need to have stature within the recruiting firm, right? It's not people at the same level who provide jobs for these new entrants. It's people who are in sort of different positions within the firm, and that's sort of consistent with the story that we're trying to get something. Social obligations among members of the workforce may compensate for incomplete contracts and work relations in markets for low and unskilled jobs. And this is important because it sort of ensures that there are barriers that may be persistent to rural migration, and this is overlooked in much of the existing literature. And the stronger this moral hazard story is compared to the information dispersion account, the more relevant this argument becomes. And then we see that this is a very impoverished rural area, and we see that employment is typically prearranged, partly because the search process itself in areas of this kind, and there was a nice experimental paper that was meant to be presented at the ISI conference, which I'm not sure was presented in the end, but which showed that if you gave people in poor areas a cash incentive to move, it didn't take them much to do, but if there was nothing, the migration level would be very low. And this is one of the reasons, I think, why we see so high levels of rearrangement here also. Yeah, and then there's this insurance argument, and then I'm done.
There are 2-3 questions.
Yeah, let's see if there are any. Let's see if there are any.
Yeah.
Anyone who wants to ask?
Any questions, clarifications, comments? Okay, let me start then.
Yeah, you start. He's been working in Palampur, which is not so far. It's sort of Moradabad is.
Very next neighboring district, and there's another study also that is going on in Moradabad basically on the diploma in engineers mobility of these.
Sure.
Now, the two questions. One is this: you're tracking a very long period of time, from 1940s onwards up to the current time.
There are a few there.
Yeah, and in a sense, is there some kind of a time pattern that you observe, in the sense the characteristics of the migrants, both in terms of who are the people who are migrating, and any kind of an idea of the cost of migration in the sense? Do you have any?
No, we see very interesting changes over time, right? The things that I think are interesting in terms of changes is that if you look at the Ansars, this is also very related to what Kaivan was talking about, right? Because you have a community, traditionally weavers, now they are all bakery people. They've become bakery people. These are very inglorious bakeries. If you go and see them, you'd think that this is very basic enterprises that they are running, but they are running these enterprises, and they've been running them for some lengthy periods of time already. What happened to start with was that they moved to eastern India, to destinations in West Bengal, to destinations that are now in Jharkhand, to destinations in Odisha, set up these enterprises in towns that there was a market, often small industrial towns. Some of these industries went out of business, and they had to adjust to that. So they moved gradually, and they are represented in states, all the states stretching from east to west, with gradually less representation in the east now. and moving towards Maharashtra and Bombay and Pune in particular. So they are essentially the large sort of concentrations of these Ansaris now. It's not where they started, very far from it. They are in Mumbai. What's interesting about it is that you see a lot of mobility amongst these Ansaris, but it's all within the same sector. So they start out as bakery workers, they become bakery vendors, many become bakery owners. So they obviously have mechanisms in place that allow them to learn what is required from this type of activity or their trade, that allow them also upwards mobility over time. That's very different from the Chamars, who are sort of in the early stages of these migration periods, agricultural and construction laborers. That's what they did. That's what they did for a very long time. That's changed. Okay, it's much more, they are doing a whole range of activities now. What's interesting also is that, and that sort of shows that there are some network spillovers here also, because the Chamars have essentially absorbed all the traditional occupations of the other Jatis in the village. Right. So now they are barbers, they are acquiring a lot of different types of skills, and they're also getting a lot of factory jobs and acquiring skills. So there's clearly huge changes going on, or at least there's sort of, none of these jobs are glorious, but there are certainly changes going on. Okay.
So these are languages, right? So I'm presuming they speak Hindi in their native place, and there's Uriya and Marathi and different languages. So that just may mean that referral to your bakery business is even more important, because you want somebody who understands you and you can give orders to, and you may not want to learn Uriya.
But you also, if you're moving to a small place, the chances of getting a job in a small place is very limited. You can move to a big place and a big city and have a fair chance because it's a large labor market, right? If you move to a small place, it's not like that. So you would expect. I mean, this pre-arrangement thing would be much more important if you move to a small destination.
Okay, so now there is no hand, so I'll again ask you a question. Communities which did not depend on agriculture per se, in the sense you find lot less migration from those communities which are agriculturally landowners communities. Here you're talking about Ansaris who were never traditionally part of agriculture.
That's right.
The Chamars and the others who we're talking about never were, in a sense, part of their agriculture. They are more mobile. So, for example, in Muradabad also the Parsis are the more mobile ones, but they never had a stake in agriculture per se. Is it something to do with what is happening to the local, what is happening at the origin rather than at the destination? Is there some kind of information, because you've interviewed the migrants further in other places also? So basically putting it to me, what did the poll push?
Yeah.
That question in a sense, and does it affect the different communities, even though maybe socially of the same ladder?
Sure.
Does it basically affect them?
No, you see, the thing is that decisions is that if you look at the Jat population, which are the landowners there, if they have moved out of their villages, it's mostly been to more prestigious jobs, right? So the Jats typically have government jobs if they were any today. While as I said, for the Chamars and the Ansaris, it's just very different patterns that we observe. In terms of the push factors or other things, these remain. If you look at the sort of old statistics, even of Western UP, we know that living conditions, government services, everything in these areas continue to be in a bad state. If you look at the local schools, there's a lot of private schools in UP, that has come up. So that is improving. But on other public services, it's still a very sort of marginal living. Anybody else? No?
A very interesting issue. We're going to hear more of this, at least in the Indian context. There is both sides of the debate that has been going on, particularly the migration of people who are, but generally what is understood is that migration is something of a good kind, in the sense people always move for better. But the kind of stories we are, at least what you are telling, what is coming out partly from your study, in the sense is that it's not something which is neutral in the sense it affects communities differently, maybe depending on the community, depending on the industry, depending on the place that you belong to, but also the role of social networks in that sense. Locational networks, social networks, your other kind of networks. So we can't basically be looking at it in the sense of a very abstract kind of a...
One quick comment here maybe. So if we believe that if these social ties really, it's not shouldn't be surprising at all, because if you look at the literature on rural organization, it's always assumed that family labor is less moral hazard prone than labor that is hired. So it's kind of a variant of that, and it seems to be the case at least that in early stages of these transitions, this may also be consistent with good management practice. Hiring people that are closely tied to each other because it enables you to better control some of these.
Okay, thanks.